Today we're going to talk about portraits, and the next week we're going to talk about genre paintings. And this was hard because there are so many amazing portraits, and portraits tell us so much about ourselves. But I hope that I will do it justice today in talking about a select few, and we'll delve a little bit more deeply. Also, this week and next week will be, I'll be taking a few liberties to try to, I want to focus on the collection, and that's what I'm here to do, but to also contextualize more of the scope of the different art movements and isms in the 20th and 21st centuries that may or may not be represented in the collection in the best way. And I guess what I mean by that is there are a lot of portraits made by people who were doing other things and are known for other things, such as, say, murals during the Mexican mural movement or something like that. So I've tried to use the examples here to launch into conversations about their broader careers. So we'll see how we do. So today we're talking about portraits in American art. And I just wanted to start off, I like questions. They help direct my thinking. And I put up a lot of examples that were on view, are on view, have been on view, just to see the range. These are all from the permanent collection. And I did this because I realized I couldn't talk about all of them in the time we have together. So what is a portrait? What are the truths and questions? What truths and questions do a portrait communicate? What might a portrait express about the person portrayed? How does it reflect the sitter's community, setting, family, or friends? What does the portrait reveal about the artist? Today we begin with questions presented on the screen because the basic fascination with capturing and studying images of ourselves and of others for what they say about us as individuals and as a people is what makes portraiture so compelling. Portraiture has occupied a central place in the visual culture of the United States from the colonial period to the present. More than simply recording physical likeness, American portraits have functioned as tools of identity making, shaping how individuals, communities, and the nation itself understand who belongs, who holds power, and how history should be remembered. For centuries, portraits have formed an important record of America's people. We know America's early colonists, leaders, politicians, merchants, and philosophers through their portraits. Very consciously, these individuals constructed, with the help of visual artists, public memorials of how they wish to be remembered by future generations. They projected their personal qualities such as prudence, leadership, and strength, their accomplishments, whether military, professional, or intellectual, and their social role or position, such as matriarch, landowner, or politician. Access to portraits in colonial America and during the Republic's early years was limited. Portraits were available to very few, largely European colonists or immigrant Americans, those who could afford this costly luxury and the houses to put them in. Unlike European court societies, early America lacked an established aristocracy or royal patronage. Thus, portraiture in the United States developed under a unique set of social and political conditions. As a result, portraiture became closely tied to the emerging middle class. As the economy grew, an entrepreneurial class of often self-trained portraitists began to serve a growing middle class who wished to preserve their likenesses for personal rather than public reasons, such as to record ideals of self-fashioning, individual achievement, and civic virtue for the posterity of their family lineage. But portraits are not just about lineage. They're also about aspiration, and they reinforced portraiture's connection to democracy and self-presentation. From the 19th century onward, new technology, the expansion of the country, and vast social and political change spurred artists to embrace modern media like photography, as well as novel approaches predicated on changes in the relationship between the artist and the subject. The advent of photography introduced inexpensive prints that were traded and collected in the first photo albums. These included images of people of different social classes and portrayals of individuals who embodied certain ideals. At the same time, portraiture also reflected and reinforced systems of exclusion. Indigenous peoples, enslaved African Americans, and immigrants were often portrayed through stereotypes or denied the agency of self-representation altogether. When they do appear, their portraits raise crucial questions. Who is making the image? For whom? And under what conditions? The trajectory of experimentation continued as the boundaries of the genre of portraiture extended yet further. Contemporary portraits depict not only the visible signs of a person's identity and appearance, but also reveal other ways in which we define ourselves: fitting in or being at odds, connections to place, home, and community, or identification with work, civic, or personal life. By the late 20th century and into the 21st century, artists explore self-presentation and the myriad ways in which identity and appearance may shift. How we picture and understand ourselves through portraiture continues to evolve as artists and their sitters explore new forms and approaches to representation and identity. In the colonial period, portraiture was largely modeled on European traditions, particularly British painting. Artists such as John Singleton Copley and Charles Willson Peale created images that emphasized refinement, material success, and moral character. Clothing, posture, and objects, such as books, landscapes, fine furniture, communicated status and values as much as facial expressions did. And facial features, I should say. After the American Revolution, portraiture took on an explicitly political role. Images of leaders like George Washington helped establish a visual language for Republican authority. These portraits balanced dignity with restraint, avoiding the overt grandeur of European monarchs, while still conveying leadership and permanence. In this sense, portraiture helped invent what American power was supposed to look like. Today, as we examine General George Washington, painted around 1779 to 1780 by Charles Willson Peale, who was one of the most prominent American artists, as we were just discussing beforehand, a family of entrepreneurs and artists of the Revolutionary era. This portrait is not just an image of an individual. It is a carefully constructed statement about leadership, nationhood, and political identity during the American Revolution. The portrait was created during the American Revolutionary War at a moment when the future of the colonies was still uncertain. George Washington was serving as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and his public image was crucial to maintaining unity, authority, and morale. Peale was deeply involved in the Revolutionary War and the cause itself. He was a painter, a soldier, and a political supporter of independence. Because of this, Peale's portraits often functioned as political tools, helping to shape how revolutionary leaders were seen by the public. In this portrait, Washington is shown in military uniform. He appears calm, composed, and firmly in control. He sits in an upright posture, which suggests moral strength and authority. His uniform identifies him as a military leader rather than a monarch. The composition balances realism with idealization. Washington looks human and recognizable. Peale was trained in the European portrait tradition, particularly, again, as I mentioned, British grand portraiture. However, he adapted the style to fit American Republican values. Unlike portraits of European kings, Washington is not surrounded by luxury. There is no throne or crown. Power is communicated through service and restraint, not excess. The brushwork is controlled and clear, emphasizing the likeness and clarity rather than a painterly drama. For Peale, accuracy mattered. This is an image meant to be trusted. Thus, the portrait serves several important functions. Washington is represented as a Republican hero. He is a citizen soldier, not a ruler by divine right. His authority comes from duty and sacrifice aligned with Enlightenment ideals. At this time, the United States did not yet fully exist as a nation. Images like this helped to create a shared visual identity for Americans. Washington becomes a stand-in for the values of the new republic: discipline, integrity, and perseverance. Portraits like these were displayed in public and private spaces to build trust and loyalty. Peale's portrait helped solidify Washington's image as the legitimate leader in the revolutionary movement. Now, I know this is no longer on view, but this, because Thomas Sully is such an important American portraitist, I wanted to bring this one back in. So here we have Thomas Sully's painting Blanche and Rosalie Sully. It's a deeply personal work that reveals not only the artist's technical mastery, but also the emotional and cultural values embedded in the early 19th century in American portraiture. Through this painting, Sully offers an intimate vision of family, femininity, and artistic identity at a moment when American art was defining itself in relation to European traditions. Thomas Sully was one of the most important and most prominent portrait painters in the United States during the first half of the 19th century. Born in England and raised partly in Charleston and later Philadelphia, Sully absorbed European artistic conventions while contributing to a distinctly American visual language. He is best known for refined, elegant portraits that emphasize grace, character, and emotional warmth rather than rigid formality. Unlike many of his commissioned portraits of political leaders and elite sitters, Blanche and Rosalie Sully occupy a different category. This painting depicts two of Sully's daughters, making it both a professional artwork and a personal statement. As such, it allows us rare insight into how an American artist represented private life within a public artistic tradition. Here, the composition presents Blanche and Rosalie seated closely together, their bodies gently angled towards one another. The figures are united not only by physical proximity, but by subtle gestures, an arm resting, a shared glance, or a mirrored posture that reinforce their bond. Their clothing is softly rendered, often in light and muted tones, contributing to a sense of calm and refinement. Sully's brushwork is smooth and controlled, particularly in the modeling of the faces and hands. The background is restrained and atmospheric, ensuring that nothing distracts from the emotional exchange between the sisters. Light falls delicately across their faces, highlighting youth and vitality without dramatic contrast. This is not a portrait of status or achievement. It is a portrait of a relationship. One of the most striking aspects of Blanche and Rosalie Sully is their emotional accessibility. The painting invites the viewer into a private familial space. Unlike formal portraits that assert authority or social rank, this work emphasizes affection, trust, and quiet companionship. The artist's choices align with romantic ideals, which valued emotional truth and inner life. While Sully was trained in the neoclassical discipline, works like this show his sensitivity to romantic sentiment, particularly when depicting loved ones. The painting also reflects early 19th century ideals of femininity. Blanche and Rosalie are presented as calm, graceful, and composed, qualities associated at the time with moral virtue and domestic refinement. Their youth is emphasized but not sexualized. Instead, it is framed as innocence and emotional depth. Their gaze suggests awareness of each other and perhaps of the viewer, implying interior lives are worthy of attention. This subtle assertion of individuality within familial harmony is a hallmark of Sully's best work. Because this is a family portrait, we must consider Sully's dual role as artist and father. The tenderness of the painting suggests not merely technical observation, but emotional investment. Harriet Goodhue Hosmer is one of the most significant American sculptors of the 19th century. Through this work, Hosmer not only revives a largely overlooked Roman empress, but also redefines how female virtue, power, and intellect could be represented in neoclassical sculpture. The statue stands at the intersection of ancient history, 19th century politics, and the struggle of women artists for intellectual authority. Hosmer was part of a generation of American sculptors who traveled to Rome in search of classical training and legitimacy. As a woman working in a male-dominated field, Hosmer faced persistent skepticism about her technical abilities and intellectual independence. In response, she cultivated a reputation not only as a skilled sculptor, but as a serious scholar of classical history. Hosmer's choice of subject matter is never incidental. She repeatedly selected women from history and myth who embodied moral strength, intelligence, and autonomy rather than passive beauty. This Pompeia Platina, the wife of Emperor Trajan, is a prime example of deliberate artistic philosophy. So who is our sitter? Pompeia Platina was the wife of Emperor Trajan, who ruled Rome from 98 to 117 CE. Unlike many imperial women primarily known for intrigue or excess, Platina was celebrated by ancient sources for her integrity, restraint, and philosophical interests. She was associated with Stoic philosophy, supported just governance, and was said to have exerted her influence quietly but decisively, particularly in securing the succession of Hadrian. Platina represented a rare Roman ideal, a woman who wielded power, not through spectacle or seduction, but through ethical authority and reasoned counsel. For Hosmer, this made Platina an ideal subject. Hosmer depicts Platina draped in classical robes that fall controlled, deliberate folds. The figure is composed and upright, avoiding dramatic gesture or overt emotional display. Her posture suggests balance rather than submission, dignity rather than softness. Her face is calm and introspective, not idealized into empty beauty. The drapery emphasizes structure and gravity rather than sensuality. The overall effect is one of moral stillness, as if Platina's authority derives from inner discipline. This is not a portrait of a decorative empress, it's a portrait of character. At first glance, Platina fits neatly within the neoclassical tradition. She's made of marble, classical dress, historical subject. But Hosmer She subtly revives the traditions. But Hosmer subtly reverts, she does subvert, that's the word I want. She subverts the tradition's assumptions, so sorry. Traditional neoclassical female figures often symbolize abstract ideals like justice, beauty, and virtue without individual agency. Hosmer, however, presents Platina as a historical thinker and actor, grounding virtue in lived experience rather than allegory. In doing so, Hosmer challenges the notion that women in antiquity were politically irrelevant, as well as the assumption that female virtue must be passive or silent. Hosmer's 19th century audience would have recognized Platina as more than a Roman empress. She embodied qualities admired and contested in Hosmer's own time: moral reform, intellectual seriousness, and female influence outside traditional domestic roles. At a moment when women were denied political power and artistic authority, Hosmer offered Platina as a counterexample rooted in history. The sculpture quietly argues that women have always shaped governance and culture, even when official narratives ignored them. The sculpture stands as both a tribute to a Roman empress and a declaration of artistic and intellectual independence in the 19th century. What I love about the collection at the Columbia Museum of Art, and it's really an emphasis for today and next week, is that there are so many regional artists intertwined with these major figures, and at the same time there are so many regional and local sitters. And we have an example of that here with the bust of Dr. Robert Wilson Gibbs I. This is a portrait sculpture by the American neoclassical sculptor Hiram Powers. Through this work, we can explore Powers' sculptural style and artistic philosophy, but also broader themes of 19th century American identity, science, and the social function of portraiture. Powers stands as one of the most influential American sculptors of the 19th century. Like many American artists of his era, Powers spent much of his career in Florence, Italy, where access to marble, skilled artisans, and classical models shaped his work. His sculpture is firmly rooted in neoclassicism, a style characterized by idealized forms, calm expressions, and reverence of Greco-Roman antiquity. He is perhaps best known for large allegorical works, such as the Greek slave, which I have here on the right side of the screen. But portrait busts were also a part of his practice, a very crucial part of his practice. These commissions allowed him to merge classical restraint with individualized likeness, creating works that balanced ideal beauty with personal identity. The subject, Dr. Robert Wilson Gibbs I, was a prominent American physician, scientist, and intellectual, best remembered for his contribution to natural history and medical science in the southern United States. A respected figure in Charleston's scholarly community, Gibbs exemplified the 19th century ideal of the learned gentleman, someone whose authority derived from education, rationality, and moral seriousness. Commissioning a sculpted bust was a powerful statement of status and legacy. Unlike painted portraits, marble sculpture carried associations of permanence, classical virtue, and intellectual endurance, aligning perfectly with Gibbs' professional identity. The bust of Robert Wilson Gibbs I presents the sitter in a restrained, dignified manner. The head is slightly elevated, the gaze forward and calm, conveying intellectual focus rather than emotional intensity. The facial features are carefully modeled, but not exaggerated. Powers avoids dramatic expression in favor of clarity and balance. The surface of the marble is smooth and controlled, with subtle transitions between planes. Hair and facial contours are simplified, reflecting neoclassical ideas rather than strict realism. The bust typically terminates at the chest without elaborate clothing or symbolic accessories, further emphasizing the sitter's mind over material display. Powers does not depict Gibbs as a man of action or emotion, but as a man of thought. The absence of strong emotion aligns with Enlightenment ideals that valued reason, discipline, and moral steadiness. By placing a contemporary American scientist within a classical sculptural framework, Powers elevates Gibbs into a lineage traditionally reserved for philosophers, statesmen, and heroes of antiquity. The bust suggests that modern science and scholarship deserve the same reverence as ancient wisdom. In the mid-19th century, American artists faced a cultural tension: how to assert a national identity while still relying on European traditions. Powers' busts resolves this tension by applying classical form to American subjects. The bust of Dr. Gibbs is not overtly nationalistic, yet it quietly asserts that American intellectual life is worthy of monumental commemoration. This work communicates stability and continuity at a time when the nation itself was approaching profound social and political rupture. Next, we turn to William Merritt Chase, who was one of the most important American painters of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I offer both portraits, even though I believe Mary Ann Hayward Taylor is the only painting on view right now, but I wanted to make sure you saw the companions together. Chase was an acclaimed American impressionist as well as a portraitist, While Chase is often remembered for his landscapes, interiors, his role as a teacher, portraiture was central to his career and to his artistic identity. Chase came of age during a period when American art was actively redefining itself. In the post-Civil War era, American artists sought legitimacy on the international stage, often looking to Europe, especially Munich and Paris, for training and validation. Chase studied at the Royal Academy in Munich, where he absorbed a painterly approach characterized by dark, rich tonalities, confident, visible brushwork, with an emphasis on surface and materiality. This background profoundly shaped his portrait style. When he returned to the United States in the 1870s, Chase helped bridge old world techniques with a distinctly modern American sensibility. Chase did not approach portraiture primarily as a vehicle for psychological introspection in the manner of later modernists. Instead, he believed a portrait should convey presence, social identity, and visual vitality. For Chase, a successful portrait was not about penetrating the sitter's inner soul, but about capturing the experience of seeing a living person in a specific moment. He famously emphasized, quote, the look of things, end quote, prioritizing perception, color, and brushwork over narrative or symbolism. This approach aligned him very closely with Impressionism, though he never fully abandoned academic structure. So let's talk a little bit about his technique. One of the defining characteristics of Chase's portraiture is his brava brushwork. And of course, slides don't pick this up very well, so I encourage you to visit the painting after our session today. Paint is applied visibly and confidently, often with broad strokes that suggest rather than define detail. Faces are modeled with remarkable economy, few strokes, yet in a convincing likeness. His key stylistic features include a loose, fluid handling of paint, especially in clothing and backgrounds. Sophisticated color harmonies, often using black, whites, and muted tones, and careful orchestration of light, usually soft ambient rather than dramatic. Chase frequently allowed costumes, textures, and surroundings to play a major role in the composition. In many portraits, clothing becomes almost as important as the sitter's face, reinforcing the ideal of social performance and self-presentation. Chase also painted many portraits of women and children, including members of his own family. These works are especially revealing of his portrait philosophy. Rather than idealizing his subjects, Chase presents them as cultivated, modern individuals, often poised, stylish, and self-aware. His portraits of women convey elegance and intelligence without overt sentimentality. In portraits of children, Chase avoids the sugary sweetness common in Victorian imagery. Instead, he emphasizes natural poses, quiet concentration, and a sense of immediacy. These works feel observational rather than staged, reinforcing Chase's commitment to perceptual truth. Chase was also a sought-after society portraitist, and this is important for these here. He often painted members of New York's cultural and economic elite. These portraits functioned as markers of status and refinement. What distinguishes Chase from more conservative academic portraitists is his willingness to sacrifice polish for vitality. While many sitters expected smooth, highly finished surfaces, Chase often left brushstrokes visible, asserting the painting as a modern work of art rather than a mere likeness. This sometimes placed him at odds with clients, but it also solidified his reputation as an artist of integrity and innovation. Chase's influence as a portraitist extends beyond his own paintings through his role as a teacher. He taught at the Art Student League and founded his own schools where he emphasized painting directly from life. He also emphasized confidence in execution, respect for individuality of vision, and he was very open to teaching women. Many of his students, including Georgia O'Keeffe early on, absorbed his belief that seeing clearly and painting honestly mattered more than rigid adherence to rules. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when many art academies limited women's access, Chase actively taught women on equal footing with men. He believed that talent mattered more than gender, which was progressive for the time. As I mentioned, he taught at the Art Student League of New York for decades, and women made up a large portion of his classes. He founded the Shinnecock Hills Summer School of Art in 1891 on Long Island, and this plein air school was especially welcoming to women and became a major training ground for them. For his teaching style, he emphasized the direct observation we've discussed, loose brushwork, and that confidence encouraging students, including women, to see themselves as professional artists, not hobbyists. Notable women students include Celia Bow, who is one of the most respected American portrait painters, Georgia O'Keeffe, Lillian Westcott Hale, Jane Peterson, Dora Wheeler, and Columbia native Anna Hayward Taylor, Augusta native Josephine Sipley Cooper, who we talked about last week, and Hilda Belcher, whose beautiful painting Scarlet and Blue is currently on view. While Chase wasn't a feminist in the modern sense, his actions mattered. He gave women access, vitality, and serious artistic training at a time when that was far from guaranteed. William Merritt Chase's portraiture occupies a crucial position in American art history. He helped move American portraiture away from stiff academic conventions and toward a more modern, painterly approach. His portraits celebrate the act of looking, the pleasure of paint, and the modern individual as a visual presence. He helped define an American version of Impressionism that balanced elegance, confidence, and artistic freedom. So a long time ago in a faraway land, when I was I was a graduate student in 1991 to 94, I wrote my thesis on Anna Hayward Taylor, working with the Taylor family and working with the biographer out of Charleston, who's Alex Moore, who helped transcribe the letters. And so at one point in my life, I probably knew exactly when and how Taylor's parents came in contact with William Merritt Chase as she was studying with him, but I will leave it to you to ask Michael and Sade to investigate the archives here to figure out when and how these particular paintings were commissioned. But it was through, it was that aspirational representation of being able to send your daughters off to be artists at a time when, as we saw last week, independent women didn't have that luxury, but then to also, as we know, the Taylors are one of the founding families of Columbia. So it's important that they had their likenesses made by someone as famous as William Merritt Chase. And I bring this as a contrast because I find that to better understand Chase's role and his style, we need to compare him with the likes of John Singer Sargent. And so we have here an example of Mrs. Hayward Taylor and then the famous, probably his most famous painting, Madam X. So in the late 19th century, American portrait painting was transformed by artists who trained in Europe but worked across national boundaries. William Merritt Chase and John Singer Sargent are just two who shared cosmopolitan backgrounds, yet each developed a distinct philosophy of portraiture. Comparing them reveals not only not a single modern style, but multiple competing definitions of what modern portrait painting could be. Both artists were trained in European academic traditions, worked internationally between Europe and the United States, rejected rigid academic finish in favor of expressive brushwork, and painted members of the cultural and social elite. Yet their similarities end at technique. Their intentions, aesthetic priorities, and relationships to the sitter differ sharply. Chase's portraits, as we've said, emphasize painterliness and perception. As we've discussed, his portraits often feel observational and perhaps informal. He invites the viewer to admire how paint constructs presence. The sitter is important, but the painting itself is equally foregrounded. In short, Chase asks, how does this person look right now in this light with this paint? Sargent represents the height of technical brilliance in modern portraiture. Trained in Paris, he combined academic rigor with astonishing speed and confidence. He used bold, economical brushstrokes with dramatic lighting and dramatic poses. Unlike Chase, Sargent often conveys a sense of authority and performance. His sitters project confidence, wealth, and social power, but not without complexity. Beneath the glamour, many portraits suggest unease or guardedness. So Sargent's question is, how does this person or sitter command space and attention? I bring this comparison to make the point that at the end of the 19th century, there is no longer a formula for painting a portrait. The impacts of modernism and the artist's desire to express themselves and experiment is infused into the genre of portraiture as well, as we've seen last week and we'll see again next week. And of course, John Singer Sargent, this painting, if you don't know its history, he painted it exactly as he saw her, even though he idealizes his sitters a little bit more. And I say exactly as he saw her because her strap on her dress had fallen onto her shoulder. And that became quite controversial to the point where he hid the painting for 30 years and then finally gave it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and said, you know, it's a shame, this was my best work I've ever done. And hopefully you can visually see the difference described. I really love sculpture, and I'm glad this week we get to talk about sculptures. So next week we will examine Diana the Hunt by Harriet Whitney Frischmuth. It's a work that brings together classical mythology, early 20th century American sculpture, and the evolving ideas of women's bodies and power. Frischmuth was born in 1880 in Philadelphia to a family of physicians. It is thought that early exposure to anatomy may have influenced her interest in the human form later in life. At the age of 19, Frischmuth moved to Paris to further pursue studies in the arts. While there, she enrolled in a class with Auguste Rodin, who would prove to be one of the most influential mentors in her life. When Frischmuth studied in Paris in the early 1900s, Rodin had already transformed the language of sculpture. His approach rejected rigid academic idealism in favor of expressive surfaces, fragmented or suggestive forms, and an emphasis on movement and emotional intensity. Rodin encouraged sculptors to study the living body, often working from live models in dynamic poses rather than copying classical statues. This environment contrasted sharply with traditional academic training, which emphasized smooth finishes, ideal proportions, and static compositions. Frischmuth encountered Rodin's philosophy through direct instruction and close observation of his methods, absorbing his belief that sculpture should convey life and vitality, not just anatomical correctness. Rodin's influence is evident in Frischmuth's lifelong focus on how sculpture could suggest the expressive potential of the human body and show movement through time. While Rodin's influence was foundational, Frischmuth did not imitate him. Where Rodin often emphasized psychological drama and emotional turmoil, Frischmuth favored balance, grace, and physical confidence. Her work replaces Rodin's intensity with a sense of controlled strength, especially in her depictions of women. This distinction is crucial. Frischmuth used Rodin's lessons to redefine the female figure, not as a symbol of suffering or passion, but as a self-directed, capable presence, a vision aligned with early 20th century ideals of modern women. Frischmuth applied Rodin's principles to create figures that are active, poised, and independent, bridging European modernism and American ideals of physical freedom and self-determination, and transforming those lessons into a distinctly American and distinctly feminine vision. Frischmuth had another major influence on her work. Her best-known sculptures were heavily influenced by dance and by dancer Dacia Deltel as her muse. Following her studies in Europe, Frischmuth returned to New York, where she enrolled in the Art Students League. She also continued to study dissection and human anatomy at the College of Physicians and Surgeons. In 1913, she purchased a house and studio where she spent the next 20 years producing her most significant and well-known work. It was here that Frischmuth first met Dacia Deltel, a young Yugoslavian ballet dancer who was making a name for herself. Deltel would go on to inspire Frischmuth's work for the next several years, and as I mentioned, serving as her main muse. Beyond the personal influences, and we're going to look more closely here now at the sculpture. Beyond the personal influences, Frischmuth drew from other sources for her sculpture. For example, here, the subject Diana the Hunt comes from Roman mythology. Diana is the goddess of the hunt, the moon, the wilderness, as well as chastity and independence. She is traditionally depicted as a virgin huntress, armed with a bow, moving freely through nature, and rejecting domestic or romantic confinement. For centuries, artists have used Diana to explore themes of female autonomy, strength, and untouchability, though often filtered through the male gaze. Frischmuth's Diana the Hunt presents the goddess in a moment of dynamic movement. Rather than standing still, she is in a contrapposto pose. She is caught mid-stride. She's often shown leaning forward, twisting at the torso, with limbs extended, and in pursuit. Her body is athletic rather than idealized. It's muscular, balanced, and alert. She appears nude, but the nudity does not read as passive or erotic. Instead, it emphasizes functionality and strength, as if the body is a tool honed for speed and precision. While the mythological theme connects the work to ancient sculpture, the sense of motion and realism is distinctly modern. Unlike static Greek statues meant to symbolize eternal perfection, Frischmuth's Diana feels temporary and immediate, as if she might leap away at any moment. This reflects broader trends in early 20th century sculpture, where artists sought to capture movement, vitality, and the psychological presence rather than idealized stillness. One of the most significant aspects of Diana the Hunt is how it redefines female representation. Frischmuth's Diana is not an object of desire, not a passive beauty, and not a decorative symbol. Instead, she embodies agency and independence. Frischmuth worked during a period when women were increasingly visible in public life, physically, socially, and politically. A time of women's suffrage, increased participation in sports, and changing expectations of femininity were all, cycling in the narrative at this time. By choosing Diana, Frischmuth connects modern women to a powerful mythic ancestor, suggesting that female strength is not new, but newly visible. And here we have Mary Ann McNamara. Robert Henry, the painter, was born in 1865 and passed away in 1929. He is an important figure in American 20th century realism. The son of a professional gambler turned estate promoter, Henry grew up in Ohio, Nebraska, and Colorado before moving with his family to the East Coast. Settling in Atlantic City, New Jersey, Henry began to paint his first oils and watercolors in about 1885. By 1886, he enrolled in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Study in Paris soon followed, but after meeting with disappointment in the official French schools, Henry found himself pursuing Impressionism and more progressive movements. Back in the United States in 1891, Henry gained a number of artistic disciples during regular meetings held in his Philadelphia studio. In 1900, he moved to New York City, taking old friends with him and making new acquaintances. With Henry as their leader, the artists began to depict subjects drawn from New York's underclass. Their paintings of the urban poor were rejected as distasteful by the art establishment. Undaunted, he began to stage his own exhibitions, beginning with the famous 8 Independent Painters held in 1908 at the Macbeth Galleries in New York. Derisive critics dubbed Henry's school as the Ashcan School, but others recognized the originality of their work. Although Henry's brand of realism was soon eclipsed by Cubism and other avant-garde styles, Ashcan modernism did much to shake American art out of its academic torpor at the beginning of the 20th century. Ironically, Henry turned his back on newer styles and spent much of his later career teaching and painting portrait commissions. This painting, Marianne McNamara, was painted around 1925, and it can help us understand the artist's late career, his philosophy of portraiture, and enduring commitment to realism as a moral and humanistic practice. Henry is best known as the intellectual and spiritual leader of the Ashcan School, a group of American artists dedicated to depicting modern life without sentimentality or idealization. From the beginning of his career, he argued that art should be alive, direct, and rooted in genuine human experience. He rejected academic polish in favor of emotional truth. In the portrait, Henry strips away unnecessary details. The background is subdued and painterly, pushing the figure forward without distraction. The brushwork is loose and controlled, allowing the surface of the painting to remain visibly worked. This reminds us that we're not looking at an illusionistic window, but at a painted object shaped by the artist's hand. What makes Marianne McNamara compelling is not narrative, but presence. Henry believed that the true goal of portraiture was not likeness alone, but the transmission of life energy, what he often called the spirit. Henry does not idealize her figures. Instead, he emphasizes structure, weight, and presence. The expression is calm, serious, and inward. There is no attempt to charm the viewer, though she is quite charming. Rather, the sitter meets us with quiet authority. Marianne is not posed as passive or decorative. Instead, she occupies the space fully. Her gaze suggests self-possession rather than submission. And this reflects Henry's ethical stance as an artist, to paint people with, not over, their humanity. Color plays a powerful role in his work. You know, he uses bold colors, sometimes with earth tones, and again, we see his flesh tones, often warm, and in some cases of his paintings of children, they got this Ashcan School name because they often look dirty because of the thick application of the paint and the lack of blending of the colors. So he's really not at all about conveying any kind of romantic softness or sentimentality. Henry painted Marianne McNamara during one of his extended stays in Ireland, particularly on the Achill Island. These trips were deeply important to him. Henry believed the people of Western Ireland possessed a directness, strength, and independence of spirit that modern life often suppressed. Marianne McNamara was not a professional model or a public figure. She was a young girl, part of a rural Irish community that Henry admired. The choice is critical because Henry did not paint her as a type or as an ethnographic curiosity, but as a specific individual worthy of sustained attention. Throughout his career, Henry's portraiture demonstrates that realism in his hands, being not about tradition, but about engagement with the paint, engagement with the real world, with people, and with the moral responsibility of seeing clearly. By 1925, American art was rapidly changing. Modernism, abstraction, and European avant-garde movements were gaining prominence. Henry was fully aware of these shifts, yet he remained committed to figurative realism, not out of trying to be conservative, but out of his personal conviction. Rather than retreat into prestige portrait commissions or abstraction, which were both viable paths at the time, he continued to seek out subjects who embodied what he believed art should be, the dignity of ordinary people. So you got him working at a time, and this is a little bit later for the Ashcan School with the show in 1908. You've got the overcrowding of the cities coming in. Jacob Riis is coming in and taking photographs and publishing books, How the Other Half Lives. You think of the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, where people are crammed into these spaces. Children are shoeless, right? They're begging in the street, and he's choosing to portray children, not to objectify them, but to show that these urban changes and this technology and progression can provide harm to all of our people in different times in different ways. So not just focusing on the elite, but really wanted to continue working on a series of children. So you'll often see most of his works are focused on these independent sitters of children, not as commissions, again, just because he wants to paint them and bring attention to their humanity and to their reality. So this may not be a portrait, but it is an example of a work of art that is influenced by surrealism and by European avant-garde styles that have come into the United States because of immigrants from World War I, World War II. And I think it's an important example to be able to ground us in the time of the early 19-teens and 20s, when American art really starts to advance and challenge European ideals. So here we have Leon Kelly's standing model. Born in 1901, Leon Kelly emerged as a singular voice with American surrealism, and he was a compelling figure bridging diverse artistic styles. Kelly's childhood was deeply intertwined with art. His father was a successful tailor who amassed a collection of paintings and sculpture, fostering in young Leon an early appreciation for visual beauty. The family's prosperity allowed for the purchase of a sprawling farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a haven where Leon spent his weekends immersed in nature, experiences that would profoundly influence his work later. He's most known for his surrealist paintings of mosquitoes and crickets. Formal artistic training began at the age of 13 when he enrolled in private lessons with Albert Jean Adolph, a teacher at the School of Industrial Art in Philadelphia. This early instruction provided him with fundamental techniques and exposed him to the works of masters, laying the groundwork for future explorations. His studies continued at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where he encountered the controversial but influential Arthur B. Carles. Carles' unorthodox teaching methods and embrace of modernism proved pivotal in shaping Kelly's artistic trajectory. He also benefited greatly from exposure to Earl Horder's extensive collection of contemporary art, including works by Matisse, Picasso, and Braque, further broadening his artistic horizons. In 1925, at the age of 24, Kelly embarked on a transformative journey to Paris. This extended sojourn proved critical in solidifying his artistic identity and exposing him to the heart of European surrealism. He immersed himself in the Parisian art scene, absorbing the innovative ideas and techniques championed by artists like André Breton and Max Ernst. Kelly's work during this period began to reflect these influences, incorporating dreamlike imagery, distorted perspectives, and a fascination with the self-conscious, all hallmarks of the burgeoning surrealist movement. So there's not much known or written about this particular work, but again, I bring it, if you will indulge me, to talk a little bit about the what is known as the International Exhibition of Modern Art. And this is also known as the Armory Show. It was an exhibition put on in 1913 in the Armory in New York City. And what happens is you have all of these European masters coming over and or submitting their work for exhibition. So what you can see in the grainy picture is everything from completely non-objective sculptures, abstract sculptures, to beautiful landscapes, to these darkened ash can school pictures being hung next to beautiful Impressionist and American Impressionist work. And so it really was, you can see from the names, if you can read them, Van Gogh, Cezanne, Rodin, Brancusi, along with being organized by Robert Henry and others of the Ashcan School, merging all of these different styles together. And you can imagine it met with some challenges. So you see here, and again, this work may not look at all to you like the Duchamp Descending a Staircase, but it did to me, so I'm taking my liberties. Of course, we have the chronophotographs that were shown at the Armory show on the far left side of the screen, so photography is coming in, and then you have the nude Descending a Staircase, and then the newspaper reactions to the nude Descending a Staircase, talking about, yes, the rude Descending a Staircase, right? Showing people crowded into the subway during rush hour. So it was a pivotal moment where you could see European modernism and the isms coming in without leaving our country, which was extremely influential. And it really led a lot of artists to reconsider, figural painting, realist painting, and that's why also I bring it in to kind of say, Robert Henry stuck with it, right? He stuck with the realist painting when others were following examples like this. Now, all of a sudden there's a gap in portraiture. And so the next two examples I bring in just to show that there's not a lot happening in the middle of the century, right? People are coming back, new European artists are coming over, fleeing persecution from World War II, from Hitler, and so we see portraiture just kind of dies out, and there's this real desire for abstract expressionism, for emotional expressionism, to move away from the figures. One artist who started creating symbolic portraiture was Marsden Hartley, and we talked a little bit about him with landscapes because he was a contemporary of George O'Keeffe and painted in the Southwest. This was a portrait of his lover, who was a German officer, and so what he does is he combines everything from the insignia on the officer's uniform to his initials, and all of these are somewhat representative of their relationship and of the person. So it's a really fascinating iconological study and biography in figuring out who the sitter was, but it came across as non-threatening in a way. People didn't want to do that work, right? They didn't see a face, they didn't see classical dress. So this is one type of portraiture happening in the early 20th century and through the mid part of the century. We also, of course, then know that with the Farm Security Administration, through the Works Progress Administration, during the Depression and into the 1940s, that photography really takes over because the Works Progress Administration hires so many out-of-work artists during the Depression, and we see all of these photographers being sent to whether it is Dorothea Lange at the Japanese internment camps in California, or whether here she's in California taking the famous photo, The Migrant Mother, to kind of show what was happening in real time across the country. So this primarily takes over as the figural portraiture. And of course, in a work like this, it's so famous and so well known, and what we don't think about, but what we want to think about in portraiture of this nature and in any kind of photography of this nature is it staged? Is it real? It communicates a certain message to it, but that was a constructed, fabricated message that the government wanted us to know and wanted us to have. So there are, if you go to the Library of Congress, this one's from the Museum of Modern Art, you can see the iterations of the whole set, the whole, photography setting, seating, and how this woman was posed and how the children were moved in and out and things of that nature. So I didn't want to jump from 1920s to 1970s and 80s without a little something in the middle, because you might have asked, well, where was the portraiture in the middle of the century? But this work is amazing and not on view right now, and I hate that, but we can't talk about portraiture, I don't think, without talking about Chuck Close. And this is one of Chuck Close's most famous sitters. This is Philip Glass, the composer, and this is the later example, a lithograph in the Columbia Museum of Art collection from 1981. This is larger than the, it's actually communicated on the screen. It's a very, very large scale work of art, work on paper. Larger than life, if you will. So now we're going to turn to the oversized portraits of Chuck Close. Phil is one of the most important, this work is one of the most important works of American photorealism and a landmark in late 20th century photography and portraiture. Not photography, printmaking and portraiture. Chuck Close emerged in the late 1960s, a moment when abstract expressionism still dominated American art. Painters like Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning emphasized gesture, emotion, and the visible hand of the artist. Close rejected this approach completely. Instead of using expressive brushstrokes, he pursued control, detachment, and process. The original Phil was painted at this time in the early 1970s, when artists were questioning what is originality, what role does the artist's hand really play, and can painting be systematic rather than emotional? And of course, these same questions were raised by the pop artists, as we saw with the Liechtenstein example last week. So originally, the first Phil was a large-scale black and white portrait of composer Philip Glass, who was a close friend of Chuck Close. He then reproduced this image using a variety of different techniques, a lithograph, used it as fingerprints, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But the subject always is rendered the same way. So the sitter is shown frontally, cropped tightly. There is no background narrative. The image is based on a photograph, and it was enlarged using a grid. Every pore, wrinkle, and hair is rendered with obsessive precision. Despite its realism, the print does not feel warm or expressive. The sitter's face is neutral, almost clinical. Close worked from photographs because he believed photographs were already flattened and non-expressive, which suited his goals. He used a grid system to copy the image square by square. The process was slow, deliberate, and mechanical. He avoided expressive brushwork, trying to make the artist's hand as invisible as possible. Importantly, Close often said he was not painting a face, but rather painting information. Although Phil looks incredibly realistic, it challenges traditional portraiture. Normally, portraits aim to reveal personality, communicate emotion, and tell a story about the sitter. Close does none of these things. Instead, the scale overwhelms the viewer like a Hudson River School landscape. It's huge. Emotional cues are removed, and the subject becomes almost anonymous. This raises a key question. If we move expression, gesture, and narrative, is it still a portrait? Close was often labeled as a photorealist, but his work is slightly different from the artists we've seen, such as Diane's Vase from last week, cityscapes, the dinerscapes, and the urban landscapes with a lot of mirrored glass. Instead, he focused exclusively on faces, repetition, and systems. His realism is not about illusion for its own sake, but about process and perception, how images are built, and how we recognize faces. Phil became a defining image in Close's career and influenced generations of artists. It established the face as a site of conceptual experimentation, painting and printing as a rule-based system, and it created a bridge between realism and conceptual art. The example of Phil we see here in this later version is when Close broke the image into visible units of grids, dots, and in this case, fingerprints, showing where the system has become visible. Phil shows that realism does not have to be emotional or expressive. By removing the artist's gesture and relying on the mechanical process, Close transforms portraiture into an investigation of seeing, identity, and control. So again, when he first did this, it was basically a grid sheet, and he's just making little individual dots. And then he begins in this work in the 80s with the fingerprints. So this is his thumb being inked, copying the picture through a series of grids and squares onto the stone, and then running the paper over it. So an extremely laborious process. And it is really conflicting, right? Because our fingerprints are so unique to our identity, yet he's trying to remove the artist's hand while intentionally using the artist's hand. So this whole idea of conceptual art, what is art? So I want to talk now about Peter Saul's self-portraits, because these are not simple representations of the artist, as we can see, but they're aggressive, satirical, and often grotesque performances of identity. Saul does not use the self-portrait to stabilize who he is. He uses it to attack the very idea of coherent, dignified self. And this one and the Audrey Flack I'll show at the end, I am not a visual artist, I'm an art historian. The idea of making something and showing it is much too vulnerable of an experience for me. And for those of you who are makers and artists in the room, I admire what you do. And I think if I did such a thing, it might look like this. And we need to think about, how challenging, that's an insult to Peter Saul, how challenging it is for, artists to communicate self-portraits in their own likenesses, So just as an aside, looking at a couple of self-portraits. Peter Saul was born in 1934, and he emerges as a key figure in post-war American painting, often associated somewhat uneasily with pop art. But unlike Warhol or Lichtenstein, Saul's work is emotional, vicious, and violently subjective. His self-portraits are where the subjectivity becomes unavoidable. When we think broadly of traditional self-portraiture, such as works as Rembrandt or those by Van Gogh, we see that they often revolve around introspection. Often there's a mastery that is depicted, or in the case of Van Gogh with the missing ear, suffering is made noble. Saul tries to blow that tradition apart, and I would say successfully does so. He presents himself as the anti-hero self. In Saul's self-portraits, the artist appears grotesquely deformed, often screaming, melting, or exploding, sometimes sexually exaggerated or abject, and cartoonish to the point of obscurity and absurdity. He presents himself not as a genius or a tortured soul, but as ridiculous, monstrous, and unstable. This is not humility, it's weaponized self-mockery. By making himself ugly, Saul denies the viewer the pleasure of reverence. One of the most striking aspects of Saul's self-portraits is their cartoon logic. Limbs are stretched unnaturally, faces contort into impossible expressions, bodies leak, ooze, or fragment. These are not just stylistic choices, they are philosophical ones. Cartoons allow Saul to exaggerate emotion beyond realism, collapse high and low culture, and to embrace cruelty without apology. In self-portraits, the cartoon language becomes a form of self-assault. Saul treats his own images in the way political cartoonists treat corrupt politicians, with savage distortion. This is not protected, it's fair game. Despite their emotional intensity, Saul's self-portraits are not confessional in a traditional sense. He does not tell us what he feels. He shows us what it looks like when identity itself is under pressure. His faces seem often overwhelmed by rage or panic, trapped inside their own bodies and unable to maintain a stable boundary. This suggests a self that is constantly invaded by politics, media, sex, fear, and aggression. Saul's self-portraits become a site where private psychology and public chaos collide. Another aspect of Saul's self-portraits is their brutal treatment of masculinity. He often depicts himself as impotent or grotesquely sexual, infantile or hysterical, or ridiculous rather than authoritative. At a time when American masculinity was often portrayed as powerful and heroic, Saul offers a vision of the male self as humiliated and uncontained. This undercuts not only artistic ego, but broader cultural myths of dominance and control. Importantly, Saul uses himself as subject is not just narcissistic, it's strategic. Much of his work deals with extreme violence, political outrage, and moral ugliness. By inserting himself into the picture, Saul avoids the position of a detached moral judge. The implication is, I am part of this mess, I am not innocent. The self-portrait becomes a way of assuming responsibility for the aggression of the work, even while amplifying it. Saul's self-portraits are not mirrors, they are battlefields. They refuse dignity, coherence, and psychological comfort. Instead, they present a self as mutable, grotesque, and deeply implicated in the violence of contemporary life. Rather than asking, who am I? Saul's self-portraits ask a more unsettling question. What does it mean to have a self at all in a world this absurd and brutal? That question, unresolved, uncomfortable, and loud, sits at the core of his work. So I took this picture myself, and I couldn't get right in front of the painting because there was a glare with the gold and the light, so I apologize for the angle. I feel it a little bit disrespectful, but I wanted to make sure we included it because Barclay Hendricks is a pretty major phenomenal figure in portraiture. Hendricks was born in Philadelphia in 1945 and died in New Haven, Connecticut in 2017. He was an American painter and photographer who revolutionized portraiture through his realist and postmodern oil paintings of Black Americans living in urban areas beginning in the 1960s and 1970s. His work fundamentally shaped how Black identity, individuality, and presence are represented in American art. Hendricks is best known for his large-scale, hyper-realist portraits of Black Americans painted between the late 1960s and 1970s. These works are visually striking, politically charged, and deeply human. Hendricks' depictions of the Black figure exude attitude and style. The artist culled subjects for his hagiographic and reverential portraits from sartorially minded friends and acquaintances he encountered around the world, including travels to Jamaica, his hometown of Philadelphia, and Connecticut, where he last lived and worked. He applied intense focus to his subjects while painting, allowing him to capture their unique personalities. Steeped in pop culture and balanced with exquisite detail, the cast of characters in Hendricks' work inhabits an unconventional realism unified by painterly mastery. While the directness of his subject's gaze could be piercing, Hendricks invoked humor through the tilting of his pieces, migrating the gravity of the message and allowing for an opening into the work. So this is my tilting unintentionally. His paintings are distinctly of their time, grounded in the style of their contemporary present, and simultaneously emphatically timeless. They are direct engagement with art history, the tradition of portraiture, and a confrontation of institutional portrayal of the Black subject. Hendricks was first a photographer before taking up painting. Beyond his portraiture, he also made distinct works on paper and painted landscapes and still lifes. Throughout his career, Hendricks refused to be boxed in to one medium, and his practice is commanding, bold, and without limitations to media or form. Hendricks came of age during the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power era, a time when Black Americans were demanding not only political rights, but cultural visibility. In mainstream museums, Black figures were largely absent, stereotyped, or relegated to secondary roles. Portraiture, historically associated with power, wealth, and white European elites, rarely centered everyday Black people with dignity and autonomy. Hendricks responded directly to this absence. Rather than painting historical heroes or allegorical figures, he turned his attention to ordinary individuals, friends, strangers, students, people he encountered on the street. This choice alone was radical. His portraits insist that everyday Black lives are worthy of monumental scale and meticulous care. Hendricks is also often associated with photorealism, but his work goes beyond mere imitation of photographs. His figures are rendered with extraordinary precision. Skin tones are layered and luminous, fabrics are sharply defined, and reflections on sunglasses and jewelry are exacting. Yet unlike traditional photorealism, Hendricks' paintings are not crowded with detail. Most of his portraits place the figure against a flat monochromatic background, often white or in a single saturated color. This strategy isolates the subject, stripping away narrative, distractions, and forcing the viewer into direct confrontation. The sitter cannot be contextualized as poor, urban, or exotic. They simply are. They just simply exist. This visual clarity gives the figure an iconic presence, recalling religious icons or Renaissance portraiture, while remaining unmistakably contemporary. One of the most distinctive features of Hendricks' portraits is his attention to fashion and style. Afros, bell-bottoms, leather jackets, platform shoes, sunglasses, and gold chains. These are not decorative details. These are expressions of self, of identity, and self-definition. Hendricks allows his subjects to present themselves as they wish. Many stand with relaxed confidence, hands in pockets, weight shifted casually, gazes direct or defiantly indifferent. This effect is subtle but powerful. These figures do not perform for the viewer. They do not seek approval. Blackness is shown as complex, cool, stylish, and self-possessed. It's not a social problem to be solved. Although Hendricks' work is deeply political, it is rarely overtly narrative or symbolic. There are no scenes of protest, violence, or oppression. Instead, politics reside in representation itself. By painting Black subjects at life-size or larger-than-life scale, with a technical refinement historically reserved for European elites, Hendricks challenges the art historical hierarchy. His portraits ask a simple but destabilizing question. Who deserves to be seen this way? Maybe all of us? This refusal to dramatize suffering is crucial. Hendricks offers no spectacle of pain for consumption. His subjects are not explanations of racism, they are declarations of existence. Hendricks was deeply knowledgeable about Western art history. He studied old master painting techniques and admired artists like Van Dyck and Velázquez. But instead of rejecting tradition, he reclaimed it. His paintings borrowed the authority of classical portraiture while subverting its exclusions. The result is a powerful revision of art history, one that inserts Black Americans into a lineage that had long denied them. At a time, his work anticipates later artists such as Kehinde Wiley, Amy Sherald, and Jordan Castile, all of whom engaged portraiture as a site of cultural and political intervention. After a period of relative neglect, Hendricks' work gained renewed attention in the 20s and 2010s, culminating in major retrospectives shortly before his death in 2017. Today, his influence is unmistakable. In an era of social media, fashion culture, and ongoing debates about representation, Hendricks' portraits feel remarkably current. They remind us that visibility alone is not enough. How someone is seen and on whose terms matters profoundly. And I think it's really exciting and important that Columbia Museum of Art has this work because we're all a flitter about Amy Sherald and Kehinde Wiley, but he was doing this, decades ago and making important statements then. And we will close briefly by discussing Audrey Flack's self-portrait with Flaming Heart from 2022. Audrey Flack was born in 1931 and emerged as a major figure in photorealism during the 1970s. However, unlike many photorealists who focused on mechanical neutrality, Flack infused her work with emotion, symbolism, and feminist perspectives. She was one of the first women associated with photorealism, and she consistently challenged the movement's male-dominated, detached aesthetic. By 2022, Flack was working on themes of morality, identity, spiritual endurance, and female experience. Self-portrait with Flaming Heart. In this work, Flack presents herself with intense directness. The composition centers on her face, which is rendered with clarity but not idealization. She chooses to incorporate the flaming heart as a dominant symbolic motif. The heart, get my page in that order, is not a decorative accessory. It operates as an emotional and spiritual core of the image, radiating outward toward the viewer. The flaming heart is a powerful and multi-layered symbol referencing Catholic Sacred Heart imagery, which is associated with suffering, devotion, and spiritual love. It is a sign of emotional intensity, passion, and lived experience. By placing the symbol in the self-portrait, Flack asserts that emotion, particularly female emotion, is not something to be hidden or restrained, but rather central to identity. Flack's use of acrylic and mixed media allows her to build texture, depth, and visual intensity. Unlike her earlier photorealist works that relied heavily on photographic sources and smooth surfaces, this painting embraces expressive color, symbolic exaggeration, and visible construction. The stylistic shift reflects Flack's long-standing belief that realism and symbolism can coexist. Throughout her career, Flack challenged traditional representations of women in art. With this work, she presents herself as aging without apology. She centers emotion rather than beauty or idealization, and she claims authority over her own image. The painting resists the historical tendency to erase older women from visual culture. Instead, Flack presents aging as a site of power, memory, and spiritual intensity. Throughout U.S. history, portraiture has been more than an artistic genre. It has been a cultural practice tied to power, identity, and belonging. By studying American portraiture, we learn not only how people looked, but how they wanted to be seen, how they were seen by others, and how those visions shape broader ideas of what America is and who counts as American. Presently, portraiture in the United States is deeply engaged with questions of identity, race, gender, sexuality, and historical memory. Contemporary artists frequently revisit traditional formats, oil painting, official portraiture, studio photography, only to subvert them. Today's artists interrogate who has historically been portrayed and how. Their works ask viewers to reconsider assumptions about authority, beauty, and authenticity. The portrait becomes a site of negotiation between past and present, visibility and invisibility. Portraits are no longer neutral images, but are active participants in social and political life. Images that both reflect and shape the world around them. Importantly, contemporary portraiture also extends beyond museums and galleries. Social media, selfies, digital avatars have radically expanded who makes portraits and how they circulate, continuing the tradition of self-fashioning in new technological forms. Thank you.